As you all know, we've been discussing the Second Great Awakening and all of the reforms that were born out of that religious movement. The greatest of them would be the reform to put an end to the peculiar institution of slavery. What is the name of that reform? What's the official name of the reform to put an end to slavery? Emancipation is the act of freeing slaves. Abolition or abolitionism. Okay? Now, there were different types of abolitionists. Some were just like, okay, let's let slavery die on its own. Gradual emancipation. Others were more radical. And probably one of the most radical was William Lloyd Garrison. Now, if we were to describe someone as a radical abolitionist, what do you think how would you describe his beliefs? Yeah, like right now. Yeah, without any exception. Like, put an end to it. And he was very stern and strict in his beliefs and would not totally uncompromising. Now, we know all this because he published his own newspaper in Boston called The Liberator. Now, this is not like your typical Register Herald newspaper that published stories about, everything going on in the community. This newspaper had one purpose: to talk smack about slavery. And that's all it did in every edition, every day. It's his newspaper. Mm-hmm. So we could almost say that his newspaper was militantly anti-slavery. Some people make the argument that when he began his newspaper in 1831, it really is the first war of words between the North and the South in the Civil War. Even though the Civil War doesn't technically start until 1860s, the Liberator brings it to the public mention, brings it to the public's notice. And he was so uncompromised, he would not tolerate the poisonous weed of slavery until it was completely stamped out, root and branch. So very, very strict abolitionist. All right. Now, William Lloyd Garrison is not, I'm not going to say he's unique, but he is somewhat unique in that he's a white man arguing to end slavery, even though he is in the North. As a significant portion of abolitionists were freed slaves. And so we're going to look at some of the greatest of those, as there were many, many great abolitionists. One is this lady, also simply known as just Isabella, but the name that she takes was Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was a freed black woman who lived in New York and fought tirelessly for black emancipation and women's rights. She would hold audiences and keep audiences completely riveted and almost spellbound with her deep, resonant voice. And she spoke with a great religious passion, with which she used religion to condemn slavery as a sin. It was sinful. Sojourner Truth was a slave and does live to see the end of slavery. As this photo on the right was probably taken around 1870. All right. By far the greatest of the black abolitionists was who? Say, very good. Frederick Douglass. And there's pictures of him from throughout his life. He escaped from slavery at the age of 21. And we talked a little bit about Frederick Douglass yesterday. But at age 21, in 1838, he escaped from slavery, where he moves to the north and is discovered by abolitionists like William Lloyd Garrison. And he began to lecture widely for the cause of abolition, despite frequent threats against his life and beatings. He even publishes a book about himself. It's called The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. It's an autobiography, in which this autobiography depicts the remarkable origins as the son of a black slave woman and a white father. He's a mulatto. And his struggle to learn to read and write, and then his eventual escape to the north. Now, Douglass is not a radical abolitionist. He is as flexibly practical as William Lloyd Garrison is stubbornly principled. Now, they're both abolitionists. They both want to see slavery come to an end. They just have very different ways of going about doing it. Garrison often appeared to be interested in his own righteousness than the substance of slavery itself, and he said it's evil, it's a sin, and it should end immediately. Whereas Frederick Douglass was a little more flexible. He would allow it to die gradually. Gradual emancipation was okay with him. Frederick Douglass was more inclined to use politics and the way of compromise to accomplish his goals. Okay? So these are just some early leaders and leaders of the abolitionist movement. Now there's obviously thousands more. These are some of the more noteworthy ones who are in the public eye, speaking out against the evils of slavery. All right? So questions about slavery, abolition, Second Great Awakening, and all the reforms that come about as a result of this increase in religious belief. Okay. All right, so now we're going to shift gears back to the political side. If you notice, we kind of go back and forth between like society stuff, and then we'll talk about women and minorities, and then we'll go back to like the government and the politics and the laws and the movers and the shakers and the things that they're doing to shape and move our country forward. So that's where we're going now. So going back to the election of 1840, and who won that election? They had a really cool campaign slogan that rhymed. William Henry Harrison, old Tippecanoe. Tippecanoe and Tyler too. Now, the 1840s, this is, right in the heart of the Second Great Awakening, and these are men that were really born in this time period when it began. So you begin to see some of the people who were born at the beginning of the Second Great Awakening now coming to positions of power in the American government. So there's going to be some issues as things that have happened in the past, like the acquisition of Louisiana, the Louisiana Purchase, what to do with Texas, what to do with California, how do we treat Mexico, how do we handle relations with Great Britain and Oregon. All of those things are going to come to a head all in the next 10 years of history, from 1840 to 1850. Okay? So William Henry Harrison was a member of what political party? He was put on the ticket by people like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster. He was a Whig. He was a Whig. Now, the real leaders of the Whig Party are Daniel Webster and Henry Clay. Don't make no mistake about it, okay? They are the uncrowned kings of the Whig Party. Okay? Now, William Henry Harrison is popular because, why? He's a war hero. He's a celebrity. Also, he's not a politician, so he has no enemies politically. So he wins the election, and the reason John Tyler's even put on the ticket is because he's from Virginia. William Henry Harrison's from Indiana. But John Tyler's from Virginia, still one of the largest states. And John Tyler is not really a Whig. He's kind of a Democrat and a Whig. He's in the middle. So they put him on the ticket in hopes of drawing those voters in the middle to their side. All right? Now, William Henry Harrison has the shortest administration in American history after giving the longest inaugural address in American history. Being the big, strong, tough general, giving his inaugural address. Shortly after his presidency begins, he contracts pneumonia and dies. Now, whether it had anything to do with the fact he refused to wear his hat and coat at his inaugural address, outside in March in Washington, giving a very long-winded 8,400-word speech, the longest in American history. I don't know if it had anything to do with him directly contracting pneumonia, but it happened. So, after a month of being president, he dies. According to the Constitution, who takes over? The vice president, John Tyler. So the Tyler 2 part of the Whig ticket is now the President of the United States. John Tyler, slender, 6 feet tall, blue eyes. From Virginia, another Virginia president. If you hadn't noticed, Virginia has had more presidents than any other state, even to this day. Gracious, kindly, gentlemanly, but very principled, stubbornly principled. And he's also not a Whig. Yet he's now the President of the United States. Oh, for the next 4 years too, by the way, because he died, William Henry Harrison died 4 months into his presidency. As I mentioned before, he was only put on the ticket to attract votes away from the fringe of the Democratic Party. So, basically, he's not really for a lot of what the Whig Party stands for. He was often at odds with issues like the bank, the protective tariff, and internal improvements. All 3 parts of the American system, which are at the heart of the Whig Party's platform. He was often at odds with that. So, the Whig Party itself turns its back on its own president. Start calling him names. I love one of the names they call him. His Excellency. Like, how you call the King of England, like His Majesty? His Excellency. Because he died, because he became president because of an accident. I love it. His Excellency. It was not uncommon to see like dummies made up to look like John Tyler and then set on fire in many parts of pro-Whig America. That's called burning someone in effigy. Burning someone in effigy. There was also a wave of influenza that was sweeping through the country that many Americans named, like they called it the Tyler Grip. Named it after him. And ultimately, before the next presidential election, John Tyler was formally expelled by the Whig Party. He was kicked out of his own party. The person who's president of the United States and is a member of your party was kicked out of their own party. And you thought 2020 was crazy. Imagine 1844. Not only was he kicked out, his entire cabinet, with the exception of Daniel Webster, who was the Secretary of State, resigned. Basically, the entire executive branch of government was I don't want to say overthrown, but turned over and replaced during his term. So needless to say, it was difficult for John Tyler to accomplish much during his presidency, as he being a member of the Whig Party, yet going against the majority party of the Whigs, it was just kind of gridlock. Interesting, yet uneventful. Okay, so now during his presidency and during the presidency of his predecessor, Martin Van Buren, there was an issue going on with Texas. Texas, when does Texas kind of literally catch Santa Anna napping and force him to sign those treaties that say Texas is free? You guys remember what year that was? 1836. 1836 is when that happened. Now it's 1844 now, so it's been 8 years since Texas had it. Texas has kind of been its own country precariously for 8 years. Does Mexico see Texas as its own country? No. They don't recognize those treaties that Santa Anna signed at the point of a gun. They simply see Texas as a province in revolt. And that's all. That will be reconquered in the future. That is how Mexico views Texas, as part of Mexico. And Mexican officials made it very clear to the United States of America that if America should try to put Texas under its protective eagle wings, that there would be fighting, that there would be war. And the Texans were kind of left on their own to fight off the Mexican government for 8 years. Vastly outnumbered. A lot more Mexican citizens than there were Texas citizens. And there was no way to be sure where the Mexican government would strike again. So, Texas needs help. Will America help them? Not for 8 years. 8 years they were on their own. But Texas was driven to get help from somewhere. Where else could they turn to? Does Texas believe that they're their own country? Yeah. So, are there any other countries that they could turn to that might be interested in helping them? Britain? France? Yeah. The Texans turned to Britain and France in hope that they could help them. They would be like, hey, we'll become part of England or become part of France if you will provide us with assistance in overthrowing these Mexican officials. Now, why would England be interested in seeing Texas independent? Well, if Texas belongs to itself, then it doesn't belong to who? America. They see it as a way of stopping the spread of America. The Republic of Texas would kind of be a check on the southward surge of the American Colossus. Our land grabbing would be lessened. So, how do you think America would view Great Britain getting involved in the affairs of Texas? Well, is it against the law? Is there anything on the books that says the Monroe Doctrine? That's right. Hey, you can't come over here. You need to butt out. You're violating the Monroe Doctrine. Remember we told you back in 1823? We're drawing a line in the sand. Don't cross it. Don't cross it. So, and France is just kind of watching like that, wanting to see both America and England fail so that they can become more powerful. So it really puts America in an awkward position because also if they were to get involved and add Texas as a state, it's going to be added as a slave state. So lots of issues going on with Texas and foreign affairs, and you got bringing in England and France and Mexico, all kinds of countries involved here. Okay. Eventually, though, we all know Texas does become a part of the United States. And Texas becomes a leading issue in the election of 1844. It is a main issue in the presidential campaign of 1844, where you have two men running for president. The Whig Party candidate, Henry Clay. Oh, Henry. The Democratic candidate, James K. Polk. James K. Polk. James K. Polk, highly pro-expansion. He wants to see America grow and grow quickly. John Tyler was not even put on the ticket. He was the incumbent. You couldn't even vote for him because he was not a member of a party. Now, honestly, John Tyler really deserves more credit than James K. Polk for bringing Texas into the fold. He's a Virginia guy. He wants to see slavery exist, and bringing Texas into the Union would help that slave power to happen. John Tyler arranges for the annexation by a joint resolution, and it just needed a simple majority. But James K. Polk wanted to make Texas a campaign issue. So a lot of the work was actually done by John Tyler, but James K. Polk gets the lion's share of the credit for it. Who wins that election, by the way? James K. Polk. Poor Henry. Poor Henry. Too many enemies. And during the presidency of James K. Polk, Texas is formally invited to be the 28th state in the United States in 1845, which they do, admitted as a slave state. James K. Polk is from Tennessee, by the way. He has a nickname. Know any other presidents from Tennessee? Can't name another president from Tennessee? He was a pretty important one. Andrew Jackson. What was his nickname? What was his nickname? Old Hickory. So what do you think they called James K. Polk? Young Hickory. Young Hickory. Small Hickory. Young Hickory. Okay. Now, in a word, if we could sum up James K. Polk's presidency, it would be like expansion. Expansion, expansion, expansion. In fact, his campaign slogan was 5440 or fight. 5440 or fight. What do you think 5440 is? Say it again, John. That's a good guess.
Borderline.
That's right. It's a line of latitude. Latitudes are those man-made lines that go around planet Earth. All right? Now, 5440 or fight, what is the implication here? Yep, that's right. We want to move the boundary line of what territory? The Oregon Territory to the 54th, 40th degree line of latitude. So, previous to this decree or this campaign promise by James K. Polk. What was the agreement over this territory? No. Well, who are the two sides that, who are going to fight?
Us and Britain?
Britain. If you remember the Oregon Treaty, back in like 1819, we said we're just going to share this territory. The Oregon Territory would be shared. Obviously, that's not going to work out. We don't share. You guys like to share? Children know that they don't like to share either. Obviously, America's not going to share. And James K. Polk runs on the presidential promise, his campaign promise, that we will take the Oregon, by the way, this dark red line right here, that's the current present day boundary. We're going to take all the way up to here, 54 degrees, 40 minutes. That's almost basically to like Alaska, okay, which we did not own at this time, all right? So we're going to take this, and if Britain doesn't give it to us, we're going to fight. We are willing to go to war over this. He ran on this slogan, like, hey, we're going to expand our territory, and if not, we're going to war, I promise you. I promise you war. Can you imagine that today? Like, hey, I promise you war if you elect me a president. Nobody wants war, but Americans were so land hungry and so expansionistic, they were willing to accept a little bit of war. Do we go to war with England over this?
No.
Did we get the 54th line? Another presidential campaign slogan, campaign promise broken. Typical. Okay? Now, the so-called Oregon country, which is what this territory, this we're fighting for, or allegedly fighting for here, was an enormous wilderness, and it sprawled from the northern coast of California all the way up to the southern tip of Alaska. And, there was a lot of, we had a claim to it, Britain had a claim to it, even the Russians had a claim to it. The British claims to this territory were pretty strong. At least to the portion that went to north of the Columbia River. So, why don't we go to war? Who are we going to war with?
Mexico?
Great Britain. How's that work out for us usually? I mean, we're 50-50. We're 50-50. Want to take a chance on that again? Nah. So ultimately, what do? We settle. We compromise. We compromise on what line?
49.
The 49th parallel, the current present-day boundary between the United States and Canada, with the Treaty of 1846, made during James K. Polk's presidency. (1846). Can you imagine a president running on a campaign slogan of, hey, we're going to take land from another country, and if not, we're going to war? I promise you that. That was popular. It won him the election. He won on this slogan, 54-40 or fight. What is it about American idealism and American thought process in 1844 that could lead a person to win an election on the campaign promise of fighting if we don't get land? What is it about Americans that this appealed to them? It can all point back to one thing, the Second Great Awakening. Okay? It is a revival in religion, and it is and people feel like what they're doing is right. In addition to, and this extends to almost every part of American life, including expansionism. And they assign a word to it in the campaign of 1844. They call it manifest destiny. Manifest destiny is the term. Manifest destiny is the belief by Americans that God manifestly destined the American people to be a hemispheric power. That God wants Americans to own the Western Hemisphere. And so, going to some place and fighting someone for their property, going someplace and overthrowing a country to take their property, well, it's our God-given right. Who says we can do that? God. That is manifest destiny. And I suppose the hand of God at work was James K. Polk. I think he looks like Loki's dad. I can see it. Can you see it? You can see it a little bit. Okay? Now, so James K. Polk of Tennessee, is the expression of the emotional upsurge of manifest destiny. The belief that Almighty God had manifestly destined the American people to be a hemispheric power. You guys know what hemispheric means, right? Half of planet Earth. So many Americans believed that we would irresistibly spread over, our democratic institutions, over at least the entire continent. At least. We need to at least be coast to coast. At minimum, a coast-to-coast nation. And then eventually we could possibly take South America as well. Another man, it was not, in the 1840s, guys, it was kind of expected that eventually Cuba, Peru would be states eventually. Cuba and Peru would eventually be states. That was a commonly thought idea. Okay? Even up into the 1940s, people still thought Cuba was going to be a state. That wasn't meant to be. But, all of, you can push it all the way back directly to manifest destiny. Okay? The idea that, we were going to be, at the minimum, a coast-to-coast nation. So when James K. Polk runs on his campaign slogan of 54-40 or fight, and the shout of all of Oregon or none, and he's running against the corrupt bargainer of Henry Clay, who's like, hey, let's just focus on improving the land and territory we have now and build more canals and ditches and roads and work on our infrastructure of what we got. It wasn't looking good for Henry Clay when this whippersnapper, for lack of a better word, takes the election. Okay? So Henry Clay loses to James K. Polk by an electoral college vote of 170 to 105. So it was pretty close. Pretty close. Polk also does win the popular vote, too. So young Hickory, unlike old Hickory, not a very impressive figure. He's 5'8", lean, white-haired, stern-faced. He took himself and life very seriously, and he dies young. Doesn't die in office, but he dies young. He is what you would refer to as a micromanager. You guys know what that is? He is unwilling to delegate authority. He must take care of everything himself. And he's methodical about it, and he obsesses over it. Hence the early grave. Hardworking, not brilliant by any means, but not unintelligent, but not brilliant. shrewd, narrow-minded, persistent. And one of his goals was to start to kind of nip at the American system, the Whig Party platform. And he wants to lower the protective tariff. He wants to take it from 32% to 25%. Who supports that? Who has always been what part of the country has always hated the tariff? South. So he had strong support of low tariff Southerners. Which eventually he's able to accomplish, lowering the tariff. A second objective is to restore an independent treasury as opposed to having a privatized bank. But he's able to accomplish that as well. His third and fourth points were he wanted to acquire some new territory. Obviously, he wants to acquire Oregon. But the prize jewel that he wants to really get is what state? Texas does become part of America during his presidency, but John Tyler had already laid the groundwork for that. He wants another crown jewel. What's the crown jewel of our nation today? California. California. He wants Oregon and California. In doing this, what does this make America? A coast-to-coast nation, fulfilling the manifest destiny. He's doing God's work. Well, what's wrong with that? What's wrong with that? What's wrong with taking California?
Does it make it uneven or something?
Well, it would.
Part of Mexico.
Hey, it belongs to another country. It's part of Mexico. I'm sure they don't mind. How would you feel if Mexico came up to Washington next week and was like, hey, you know what? We want New Mexico back. We're just going to take it. You cool with that? How do you think Mexico felt when we were like, James K. Polk was like, God wants us to have California. I'm sure they'll understand. Good Catholic people down there in Mexico. I'm sure they'll be cool with it. Well, how do you think that Mexico feels about James K. Polk's ambition to, it's not a real big piece of land anyway. How do you think Mexico feels about that?
Annoyed.
Not good. Insulted. They're their own sovereign nation. Does that deter us? Do we get California? How?
The Mexican-American War.
We fight them. Now, let me ask you this. We get California through war. We get as much of it as we want. Actually, we get California, New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, or not Utah, Nevada, and Texas as a result of the Mexican-American War. We add another third to our nation. We'll go fight Mexico, but about that. 54-40 or fight. We'll just draw a line. Why are we drawing compromise lines here and fighting here? Britain is powerful and Mexico is not. Pretty simple. That is why we'll take all of Texas and all of Mexico almost. We take 1/3 of Mexico from them, by the way, guys. 1/3 of their country we take from them. We take it. So we'll take all of Texas and all of, gets a significant portion of Mexico. Half of Oregon. Half of Oregon. Actually, only the half that belonged to us, really, anyway. We just drew a line. And the reason's simple. Great Britain is powerful, and Mexico is weak. So James K. Polk neither got 54-40 nor a fight from England. But he does get a war with Mexico, which is one of the more interesting wars, in my opinion. Okay. Questions on that?